There's an old classic Jewish joke about milk. It goes like this. There was a blind man, and he always wanted to understand, what does milk look like? What is milk? So he asked his friend to explain it to him. And the friend says, well, milk is a white liquid. Well, the blind guy says, I know what a liquid is, but white, what's white? You know the old saying, go explain colors to a blind man. So the friend says, white, that's the color of a swan. So the blind friend says, well, what does a swan look like? Well, a swan is a big, white seabird with a crooked neck. Crooked neck? What's crooked? So the friend says, well, crooked, it's like my elbow. Just put your hand right there, and that's crooked. So the blind guy puts his hand on his friend's elbow, and in a moment of enlightenment says, now I know what milk is. And this question is an introductory question to today's discussion of the parsha of Mishpatim, where amongst other things we have the commandment not to mix milk and meat. And the question is, do we know what milk really is? Before we come to milk and meat, I want to preface a general discussion, which actually is going to be kind of the focus of today's talk, about what Mishpatim is. Mishpatim, of course, means precepts, judgments. And I hope you recall from our previous lectures that it is one of the three categories of the commandments. There are Mishpatim, Chukim, and Edot. There are three names that we find used to categorize and to characterize the commandments of the Torah. And each one brings out a different aspect. Mishpatim are what are generally referred to as the utilitarian commandments, meaning that they promote peaceful coexistence, but more essentially, they are the ones that are comprehensible by human intellect. And it would be well to point out here, by the way, that, of course, God, who is completely transcendent and infinite, doesn't command something because it's logical. That would be putting the cart before the horse. In fact, because there is a divine intention that at least some of the commandments will be comprehensible, so God has, in a sense, molded our minds in a fashion that fits the godly version of reality, so that we find things like not stealing and things like not killing, for example, as something which makes sense. And hence they, at least in English, become referred to as these utilitarian commandments, which is a bit of an oxymoron because utilitarianism actually promotes the idea that these laws come into being because of their utilitarianism, whereas the Torah dimension of it says that they are first and foremost divine commandments, and which we have to fulfill because they are divine commandments. And yet, not only does that impact our relationship with God. But actually, if we look at the benefit that society has, the fulfillment of the even so-called utilitarian commandments is much more intense and much more reliable when people do it, because we see this as the will of God. And yet, of course, there are the chukim. Literally, the laws is the best way of translating chukim. Interestingly, it comes from the word lachkok, which means to engrave. And it seems to be connected to the fact that laws at one time were literally carved in stone. And I recall hearing that in English, for example, you have statutes, which are also laws, and that it is indeed connected to the word statue, which is something which is carved. And then, of course, there is a third category, the edot. The edot are the testimonies. They are commandments which we would not have thought of, and yet they are logical once they have been given, and they are literally testimonies. They testify to something, they commemorate something. So Pesach is edut, tzitzit is edut, Shabbat is edut, and so on. And so we have these three categories of laws. So now let's look at our parsha. It's called Mishpatim. And if we take this really wonderful and fascinating concept that the parsha has a name, which is the name of every single verse of the parsha, and in some way has to relate to it. So we can ask a question here. Do we really find that everything in the parsha fits into the concept of Mishpatim? And right away, to return to my opening anecdote, we see that in the list of commandments that are in the parsha, we have there prominently the prohibition to mix milk and meat, which is clearly not one of the Mishpatim. And Maimonides, in describing the categories of the commandments, clearly illustrates the chukim, the so-called supra-rational commandments, with kashrut. He says the laws of kashrut are in fact not per se grounded in human logic or in hygiene or in health. They are chukim. And so the question is, we can either say that the opening phrase of the parsha, ve'elo hamishpatim, and these are the precepts, refers to the general list of concepts, or we can go one step deeper and say that the presence of the commandment not to mix milk and meat also relates to this concept of Mishpatim. The concept of Mishpatim representing that part of our service of God depends upon us not only following because of our faith, but also the necessity to bring this faith into what are called the vessels of intellect, to internalize, so that the service of God through the fulfillment of commandments becomes something that we feel is personal to us.